There was a version of America where the full-size rear-wheel drive sedan defined everything. The 1960s built that world. Big engines, body-on-frame, rear-wheel drive as a given. The Impala sat at the center of it, one of the best-selling cars in the country. Then the oil shocks hit, regulations tightened, and inside GM, priorities began to change. By the early 1990s, that formula was gone, and with it, the full-size American performance sedan. Then, in 1994, GM brought it back. Blacked out. Body on frame. Corvette-derived V8. The response was immediate. It created a demand General Motors couldn't keep up with. And then, in 1996, it was gone again. No successor, no explanation. Just 3 years of production, 67,000 units, and a car people were still lining up to buy. So, why build exactly what the market wanted, and then kill it at its peak? To answer that, you have to understand what the full-size American sedan had already become by the time the Impala SS returned. The Chevrolet Caprice had spent most of the previous decade becoming invisible. It was the car that taxicab companies bought in bulk. Police departments ordered them by the fleet. Rental agencies ran them until the wheels nearly fell off. The body-on-frame, rear-wheel drive, V8-powered full-size sedan was being written off by the automotive press as a relic. An embarrassing leftover from an era when fuel economy wasn't a conversation anyone wanted to have. GM's corporate direction through the late 1980s and into the early 1990s was pointed firmly toward front-wheel drive, smaller platforms, and the kind of efficiency-focused product lineup that the accountants believed the market demanded. The B-body platform, which had been the backbone of GM's full-size cars since the early 1960s, was tolerated rather than celebrated. It survived because it was cheap to build, fully paid off in development terms, and useful to people who needed a large, durable vehicle that could absorb punishment. The police market understood this better than anyone. The Caprice 9C1 police package was the version that law enforcement agencies actually wanted. It came with the heavy-duty suspension, the larger alternator, specific wiring provisions, and eventually the LT1 V8, because departments needed cars that could handle high-speed pursuit, constant hard braking, and the kind of daily abuse that would destroy an ordinary sedan in months. The cops got the good version. The public got bench seats and a vinyl interior that smelled like a waiting room. And here's where it gets interesting. Before the Impala SS existed at all, a specific group of buyers had already figured out what GM wasn't offering them. Enthusiasts were showing up at police fleet auctions and buying retired Caprice 9C1 units specifically because they wanted the performance specification that the factory wouldn't sell them through a regular dealership. They wanted the LT1. They wanted the heavy suspension. They wanted the body-on-frame durability. They were so determined to get it that they were purchasing surplus law enforcement vehicles and converting them into street cars. Product planners at GM watched this happen and drew the obvious conclusion. There was a documented retail market for a factory-built, high-performance, full-size rear-wheel drive sedan, and GM wasn't serving it. The Impala SS wasn't born from a top-level executive mandate. It came from people inside the company who looked at the evidence and made an argument. The platform can do this. The engine is already there. The buyers are already telling us what they want by purchasing police cars at auction. Build the car properly and sell it through dealerships. The economics made sense on paper. The B-body's development costs had been fully absorbed years earlier. No new platform investment was required. The LT1 engine was already being deployed across the Caprice lineup from 1994. A suspension recalibration, a wheel and tire upgrade, and a specific exterior treatment were genuinely the primary ingredients. For a relatively modest program investment, GM could offer something the domestic market hadn't seen in years. A full-size 2-ton, rear-wheel drive sedan that was built to be driven hard. The Impala name hadn't appeared on a Chevrolet in over a decade at that point. It carried weight with a certain generation of buyer, the kind who remembered when a full-size Chevrolet with SS badges meant something specific about how the car behaved at speed. Bringing that name back on a blacked-out B-body with a Corvette-derived engine was either a bold statement about what GM still believed in, or a final goodbye dressed up to look like a beginning. As it turned out, It was both. The 1994 Detroit Auto Show reveal introduced the car to an audience that responded with genuine enthusiasm. And for a brief window, the enthusiasm was entirely justified by what the car actually delivered. The internal argument for the Impala SS needed a champion. Inside GM, that person was Jon Moss, a product planner who believed the B-body platform still had a serious performance identity waiting to be unlocked. Rather than write a memo, he built a concept car and took it to SEMA in 1992 to let the public answer the question for him. The concept was straightforward in the way that the best ideas usually are. Take a Caprice, strip the chrome, paint it black, lower it, fit larger wheels, add the SS badges that hadn't appeared on a full-size Chevrolet in years. Don't overthink it. The bones are already there. What happened at SEMA was the kind of response that makes product planners feel briefly invincible, not polite curiosity. Genuine enthusiasm from people who had spent years watching GM move in a direction they didn't want, who had been buying police package Caprices at fleet auctions because the retail lineup wasn't giving them what they were looking for. Here, in concept form, was the car they'd been describing. They wanted it immediately. Moss brought that response back to GM. The argument wasn't complicated. The platform was paid for. The LT1 was already being deployed across the B-body lineup for 1994, regardless of what happened with the SS program. The suspension work required was a recalibration, not a reinvention. The exterior treatment was mostly subtraction, remove the chrome, go monochromatic, fit the right wheels. Low development cost. Existing engine, existing platform. Documented buyer demand. GM in the early 1990s was still recovering from serious financial pressure, and every program had to survive that scrutiny. This one did, precisely because the numbers were so defensible. The 1994 production queue stayed remarkably close to what Moss had shown in 1992. Black exterior, body color trim, lowered stance, the SS badges. The philosophy was preserved almost entirely from concept to showroom, which is rarer than it sounds in a company GM's size. It started with a black Caprice at a trade show and a room full of people who couldn't hide that they wanted it. What Moss had proven at SEMA was that the appetite was real. What the engineering team had to prove next was that the car behind the appearance could actually back it up. Before getting into the engine, there's a claim worth addressing directly because it follows this car everywhere. The Impala SS does not have the same engine as the Corvette. That's the short version. The longer version is that they share the same block, the same heads, the same reverse flow cooling architecture that sent coolant to the cylinder heads before the engine block, and the same Optispark optical distributor. The architecture is identical, but the Corvette's LT1 produced 300 horsepower. The Impala SS's LT1 produced 260. The 40 horsepower separating them lives entirely in the camshaft profile and the exhaust configuration, not in the block, not in the heads, the cam, the exhaust. That's the whole difference, and it isn't a sign that GM shortchanged the Impala SS. It's a sign that GM tuned it specifically for a 4,200-pound sedan, prioritizing torque low in the rev range over peak horsepower at the top. Two different tools, built from the same raw material, sharpened for two different jobs. By 1994, the LT1 was also being fitted across the entire B-body lineup. The Caprice Classic, the Buick Roadmaster, and the Cadillac Fleetwood were all running versions of it. What made the Impala SS different wasn't that it got the engine. It was what that engine meant sitting under the hood of a blacked-out 2-ton sedan wearing SS badges. That torque number was 330 pound-feet, arriving at 3,200 revolutions per minute. In a car that weighed as much as the Impala SS, that mattered far more than peak horsepower. The LT1 didn't need to scream to move the car with authority. It pulled from the bottom of the rev range with the kind of unhurried confidence that made the car feel considerably faster than its specifications suggested on paper. Period road tests from Car and Driver and Motor Trend put the 0 to 60 time at approximately 6.5 seconds and the quarter mile at approximately 15 seconds flat. For a production sedan in 1994 that weighed over 2 tons and seated 5 adults in genuine comfort, Those were serious numbers. The car wasn't competing with the Corvette. It was competing with the idea that a full-size American sedan couldn't be driven with any real intent, and it won that argument convincingly. There is one thing worth knowing before looking at one of these on a listing today. The Optispark optical distributor sat mounted at the front of the engine, directly behind the water pump. When the water pump failed, and eventually they all did, coolant intrusion could destroy the Optispark's optical sensors in the same event. The repair required replacing both components simultaneously. A water pump job that looks straightforward becomes a double replacement because doing one without the other is a short-term fix that brings you back to the same problem. Any seller who mentions a recent water pump replacement but says nothing about the Optispark is either uninformed or hoping you aren't. It showed up identically across every LT1 application, from the Corvette to the Camaro to the Fleetwood, which means any mechanic familiar with those cars brings exactly the same knowledge to the Impala SS. For a 30-year-old performance car, that kind of cross-platform service familiarity is genuinely valuable. What the engine gave the Impala SS was credibility, not on a dyno sheet, but in the way the car felt when someone who knew engines looked at what was under the hood and understood the lineage. This wasn't a warmed-over fleet motor. It was the same architecture GM trusted to motivate their sports car, recalibrated for a different purpose, and the 40 horsepower the factory left on the table was sitting right there in the camshaft, waiting for anyone who wanted to go looking for it. The 1994 Detroit Auto Show gave the Impala SS its public moment, and the car arrived exactly as it had been conceived at SEMA 2 years earlier. Black, monochromatic, no chrome trim breaking up the body, a lower front air dam, specific badging, and 17-inch wheels that sat flush with the rear quarter panels in a way that communicated intent without announcing it loudly. The Caprice Classic it was built beside used chrome accents and a softer visual posture. The Impala SS looked like the Caprice had stopped apologizing for itself. The black-only specification for the launch year was a deliberate product decision, not a cost-saving measure. GM's option records confirm the 1994 Impala SS was offered in a single exterior color. That kind of restriction communicates something specific about how a manufacturer wants a car to be received. It says the identity is fixed. It says the car isn't trying to be everything to every buyer. It says this is what it is, and if you want it, you know why. The same logic would appear years later with low-volume performance variants from other manufacturers. In 1994, on a 2-ton American sedan, it felt quietly unusual. Dark cherry metallic joined the palette for 1995 and 1996, but the black 1994 remains the definitive visual statement, the version people picture when the nameplate comes up, because it arrived first and because the restriction itself became part of the car's character. The market responded in a way that validated everything Jon Moss had argued internally. First-year allocations sold out. Dealers marked cars above sticker, which is the automotive equivalent of the market correcting for a price that was set too low. Enthusiasts who had spent years watching GM move toward front-wheel drive, toward downsizing, toward a product philosophy that seemed to have no room for a rear-drive V8 sedan, came back to Chevrolet showrooms. Some of them had been the same buyers purchasing police package Caprices at fleet auctions. Now the factory was selling them the car directly, and they were buying it. Approximately 21,400 units left Arlington Assembly in Texas for the 1994 model year. The plant that built the Impala SS also built the Caprice Classic, the Buick Roadmaster, and the Cadillac Fleetwood on shared lines. The same workforce assembling the police pursuit key and the performance street sedan in the same building, because underneath the different trim specifications, they were built from the same bones. That production number felt modest at the time and looks impossibly small now. 21,000 units across an entire country from a manufacturer the size of General Motors for a car with genuine historical resonance behind the name and a legitimate performance engine under the hood. The demand existed, the platform existed, the engine was already there regardless of what the SS program did. And still, just over 20,000 found buyers in year one, not because demand ran out, but because that was what the allocation allowed. Period Press was straightforward in its conclusions. Car and driver and motor trend Both put the car through proper evaluation and found what the specification promised: a full-size rear-wheel drive sedan that could be driven with real intent, that felt planted and predictable at speed, and that made no apologies for its weight or its size. The reviews didn't frame it as a surprise. They framed it as something that should have existed sooner. That consensus, from publications that spent 1994 testing far lighter and more focused machines, said more about what the Impala SS actually was than any single performance number could. The 1995 model year arrived without drama. GM didn't reinvent the car. They didn't need to. Dark cherry metallic joined black as the second available exterior color, and that was the most significant change anyone could point to. No mechanical revisions, no suspension updates, no power output adjustment. The LT1 still produced 260 horsepower and 330 pound-feet of torque. The 17-inch wheels still wore the same P255/50ZR17 rear tires that had required a specific engineering step the standard Caprice never needed. The 255-section rear tires were wide enough that GM's engineers had to manually verify and adjust the rear body panel openings to guarantee clearance through the full range of suspension travel. That isn't a bolt-on upgrade. It's a body engineering change documented in period development accounts that the Caprice Classic's wheel openings simply hadn't been designed to accommodate. The 4-speed automatic transmission, the 4L60-E, carried over without modification, drawing on the same service ecosystem shared with the Silverado, the Suburban, the Tahoe, and the Corvette. When a platform is right, you don't fix it to prove you were paying attention. What the 1995 model year produced was the highest single-year output of the entire 3-year run. Approximately 23,088 units left Arlington Assembly, a number slightly above the 1994 total and slightly above what the final year would deliver. The market wasn't cooling. If anything, word had spread. Buyers who had missed the 1994 allocation, who had heard from someone who owned one, who had read the car and driver piece and filed it away, were showing up at dealerships with the specific intention of getting one before the window closed. The interior deserves a moment because there are details in there that most people walk past without registering. Sport bucket seats replaced the Caprice's bench, which changed the character of the front row considerably. A leather-wrapped steering wheel, a specific gauge cluster that read differently from the standard Caprice instrument panel. These weren't luxury touches, they were functional ones, placed where a driver actually looked and sat. The materials were ordinary by any honest assessment. The door panels didn't pretend to be anything they weren't. The dashboard was the same basic architecture shared across the B-body family, but the bucket seats and the gauges told you clearly what the car was for, and that clarity mattered more than the grade of the plastic surrounding it. Here's the detail worth hunting for if you ever sit in one. The gauge cluster is fully analog. Physical needles moving against printed arcs, no menus, no screens cycling through information the driver didn't request. A tachometer, a speedometer, oil pressure, temperature, fuel. Everything the driver needed to know, visible at a single glance, the same way a pilot reads instruments rather than a phone. In a car built around the idea that driving should feel connected and deliberate, the instrumentation matched the philosophy exactly. And in 1994, that wasn't a retro gesture. It was simply what a serious American sedan looked like from the inside, before the screens arrived and made it something else entirely. The 1996 model year continued without change. Approximately 22,731 units were produced, close to the 1994 figure, and just below the 1995 peak. 3 years of production across all model years totaled approximately 67,253 units, a number that represents every buyer who got one before the door closed. What's worth understanding about that total is what it isn't. It isn't a failure number. 67,000 units across 3 years for a performance variant built on a fully amortized platform at a price point around $22,000 represents a commercially viable product. The Impala SS wasn't struggling. It wasn't being ignored. The buyers were there. The platform, though, was running out of time for reasons that had nothing to do with what the Impala SS was selling. While buyers were lining up for the Impala SS, GM's attention was already somewhere else entirely. The mid-1990s SUV market wasn't growing gradually. It was accelerating in a way that rewrote every product decision GM made internally. The Tahoe, the Suburban, the Yukon, these weren't just popular vehicles. They were generating profit margins that passenger cars, regardless of how well they sold, simply couldn't touch. A buyer walking into a Chevrolet dealership and choosing a Tahoe over a sedan wasn't just making a different purchase. They were handing GM a significantly larger return on the same factory floor space, the same assembly hours, the same supplier relationships. Arlington Assembly in Texas, the plant that built every Impala SS that ever left the factory, was sitting at the center of this calculation. The same facility producing the Caprice Classic, the Roadmaster, the Fleetwood, and the Impala SS was being evaluated for what else it could build. SUVs needed capacity. Arlington had it. The arithmetic wasn't complicated. It's worth pausing here to ask what the alternative could have looked like, because the answer isn't entirely hypothetical. GM had access to Holden in Australia, which was already building rear-wheel drive performance sedans on a modern platform. A Holden-derived Impala SS, imported or adapted for the North American market, was a path that existed in principle. Other manufacturers were doing exactly that kind of platform sharing across international divisions. GM chose not to pursue it, at least not until a decade later, when the Pontiac GTO arrived on the Holden Monroe platform in 2004, by which point the B-body buyers had been waiting 8 years with nothing to show for it. The option was there. The will wasn't. GM's internal projections put the Impala SS's annual sales somewhere between 25,000 and 40,000 units. That range sounds reasonable until it sits next to the numbers the Tahoe was generating, and then it starts to look like a different kind of argument. One factory floor producing one Impala SS at a time, against a truck platform running at full capacity on vehicles that returned more per unit. The accountants didn't need a long meeting to reach a conclusion. But the SUV margin story was only part of it. The B-body platform itself was aging into a compliance problem. Federal safety standards were tightening. OBD2 engine management requirements were coming, and the B-body's entire lineup arrived at that deadline, still running OBD1. The 1996 Impala SS, the final model year, shipped without OBD2 compliance. Not because the technology didn't exist, but because GM had already decided the platform was ending and refused to invest in updating it. Bringing the B-body into OBD2 compliance across the Caprice, the Roadmaster, the Fleetwood, and the Impala SS simultaneously would have required real capital against a platform whose combined retail volumes were declining year over year. GM looked at that math and chose not to spend the money. The 1996 model's OBD1 engine management isn't a footnote. It's a paper trail showing the decision to kill the platform was made well before the last car rolled off the line. The decision, when it came, applied to every variant at once. The Caprice Classic ended, the Buick Roadmaster ended, the Cadillac Fleetwood ended, the Impala SS ended. No single model's sales performance triggered the outcome. The entire B-body platform was discontinued simultaneously, which is the detail that matters most when someone argues the Impala SS was killed because it failed. It wasn't. The platform it lived on was discontinued for reasons that had accumulated across the whole B-body family, and the Impala SS went with it regardless of what its own sales figures said. What makes this harder to accept, even now, is that there was no successor being developed. No next-generation B-body, no performance sedan waiting in the wings to carry the identity forward. GM's product pipeline for full-size rear-wheel drive sedans simply ended in 1996 and stayed empty. The Impala name would return in 2000, but on a front-wheel drive W-body platform that shared nothing with what had made the badge worth wearing again. The engineering philosophy, the body-on-frame construction, the live rear axle, the torque delivered low in the rev range to a car heavy enough to need it. None of that carried forward. GM had the car. They had the buyers. They chose the balance sheet, and the Impala SS became the last of something rather than the beginning. The factory went quiet on the B-body in 1996, and the silence that followed was longer than anyone anticipated. GM's Arlington plant retooled, as planned, to support truck and SUV production. The Tahoe got the capacity it needed. The balance sheet reflected the logic everyone had agreed to, and the buyers who had been lining up for Impala SS units were left with a simple fact. There was nothing else to buy that was remotely like it. The Impala name came back in 2000. What wore it was a front-wheel drive W-body sedan with a V6 engine, sharing its platform with the Pontiac Grand Prix. It was a competent car. It sold in large numbers. It had absolutely nothing to do with the car that had made the badge feel like it meant something again. Same name, different vehicle, different philosophy, different everything. The buyers who had owned the B-body version understood this immediately and mostly didn't follow. A front-wheel drive Impala SS arrived for the 2004 model year, also on the W-body platform. Same problem. The name was there. The rear-wheel drive wasn't. The body-on-frame construction wasn't. The live rear axle and the torque from the bottom V8 weren't. The car was quick enough by the numbers of its era, but numbers weren't really the point. The point was a specific character that came from a specific way of building a car, and that character didn't transfer to a different architecture by attaching familiar badges to it. The actual domestic rear-wheel drive performance sedan segment sat essentially empty for years after 1996. GM's only rear-drive performance offering by the early 2000s was the Corvette, which is a sports car, not a sedan. The Cadillac CT-SV arrived for 2004 with a supercharged V8 and genuine performance credentials. And it was an excellent car, but it was a different kind of machine, a European-influenced sports sedan rather than a body-on-frame American one. And it occupied a price point significantly above where the Impala SS had lived. What the market had been given with the B-body Impala SS was a full-size performance sedan at roughly $22,000. What came after, if it came at all, arrived in a different category entirely. The 67,000 units that left Arlington across 3 years have aged into something most of their original buyers didn't fully predict. The Impala SS registry tracks surviving examples at VIN level, documenting which of the 67,000 are still accounted for and in what condition. Collector interest arrived early enough that documented attrition from neglect is lower than it might have been otherwise. Clean examples trade today at prices well above their original purchase price, treated by the market the way it treats muscle cars, as artifacts of a specific moment in American automotive thinking that didn't extend past its own brief window. What the car proved in 3 years and 67,000 units was that the appetite for a full-size rear-wheel drive V8 American sedan hadn't disappeared. It had just been ignored. And once GM stopped ignoring it, even briefly, the response was clear. The platform ended before the market did. The Impala SS wasn't killed because it failed. It was killed because something else was more profitable, and those are two very different things. GM had the platform, had the engine, had the buyers, and had the evidence that the demand was real. The car itself delivered exactly what it promised. A 2-ton rear-wheel drive V8 sedan that felt planted and honest and entirely unapologetic about what it was. The decision to end it wasn't made on the factory floor or in a road test. It was made in a room where the Tahoe's margin looked better than the Impala SS's, and that was enough. Click the video on screen now. Ford made the same call in 2011 with the Lincoln Town Car, the last body-on-frame rear-wheel-to-drive luxury sedan in America, ended for the same reason this one was.